Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So yeah, I thought I'd make a video about the Joker because not only is it probably the best movie of the year, at least so far, but there are many topics in this movie that I really wanted to discuss, which are kind of men's rights adjacent, I guess. It definitely touches on male disposability to some degree, and the empathy gap most definitely. And how could I pass up the opportunity of talking about this movie considering the social justice toxic media went absolutely fucking nuts over it, claiming that it was going to lead to an incel massacre and all this fucking nonsense. I actually think that many of those toxic journalists wanted a shooting and were actively encouraging a shooting. Now, I know that sounds like a terrible accusation, but I don't doubt that some of them were kind of hoping that it would happen. And let's face facts here, the way they reported it most definitely would have encouraged someone who was mentally unstable to maybe go do something. And I think we're probably lucky that it didn't happen. And it's particularly ironic considering just a few years ago they were claiming that MRAs were boycotting the latest Mad Max movie, which was bullshit. MRAs were not boycotting that movie. And of course they claimed that MRAs were boycotting Star Wars The Force Awakens because we're all a bunch of racists or something. Once again, absolutely not true. And they also claimed that MRAs did a special edited cut of The Last Jedi because we thought there were too many women in it or some bullshit. Once again, fucking not true. All this was fake news. All this was propaganda. And then these same type of people come out and claim that the Joker's a bad movie because it has a white male in it. And we can't be sympathetic to white males, can we? No matter what the circumstances are for the particular character. Like I said, the empathy gap is a major theme in this movie. Now, I should point out that in no way do I encourage or support anyone doing any type of mass shooting or violence. I shouldn't have to say that, but, you know, that's the world we're living in. And because I am attempting to understand this particular character and maybe have some type of empathy and sympathy for him, does not mean that I support the bad acts that he does. But I do think it's essential that we understand people like this in real life. Maybe that way we can stop the next Columbine shooting or any of the numerous mass shootings which have happened since. The Columbine one sticks in my mind in particular because I remember seeing an interview of some of the students. I can't remember where. I've looked, but I can't find the particular news report. But going from memory, some of the students said something like, I don't know why those guys did it. They were really weird. We used to pick on them a lot. I think you just answered your own question why they did it. Once again, not excusing what they did, but I think it's important to understand why these people do what they do. And that way maybe we can prevent some of it. And maybe instead of the media demonizing these people and thus encouraging them to do acts of violence, maybe as a society instead we could have a little bit of sympathy and empathy for them and maybe set up some structures to help them and maybe stop some of the mass shootings before they happen. Now, obviously it won't stop them all because it's a complex issue. Many of the people who go on mass shootings are mentally ill and will probably do it anyway. Others have political motivations. Like I said, it's complex. Now, I should point out, needless to say, there will be spoilers right throughout this video. In fact, I intend to go through the plot in great detail, so this might actually be a rather long video. Probably something good to listen to on the way to work or while you're exercising or playing a computer game or something. But obviously there will be spoilers, so if you have not seen the movie and you want to go in spoiler free, I suggest that you watch this after you've watched the movie. On the other hand, if you've already seen it, or if you don't care about spoilers, grab yourself some popcorn because this potentially could be a long one. Now, I have heard people refer to some of the influences for the Joker, and they've mentioned Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. this is obvious. Many of you probably don't know The King of Comedy. It's a great movie. I was introduced to it when I was 18, when a good friend gave me a videotape with that and Raging Bull on it. Personally, I think Raging Bull's the better of the two movies, but The King of Comedy is a great movie regardless. I mean, what can I say? It's Scorsese, so it has to be good. But I think there are some other movies that we can draw somewhat parallels to. One that comes to mind is Falling Down with Michael Douglas. It's been a long time since I've seen that movie, but I think the connection is pretty obvious. It's someone who is pushed too far by society and reaches a breaking point, although that character is fairly different to the one we see in The Joker. The other movie which comes to mind, which surprisingly I haven't heard anyone mention, is the Stephen King movie Carrie. I would think that the connections here would be pretty self-evident, and if you don't see those connections, you probably will by the end of this video. Okay, so I should say that I'm dividing this video into 3 segments, or I'm reviewing the Joker movie in 3 parts. The first part I am going to call Arthur, the second part I'm going to call Transformation, and the third part of the review I'm going to call Joker. Now, I think those names should be pretty self-evident and give you some kind of idea of the structure of the movie and this review. So I guess without any further delay, I'd better get stuck into it. Although, just before we get to the first part, I want to play to you a very short song lyric which really came to mind when I was watching this movie for the first time. Okay, so that song lyric is really relevant for the third part, which is Joker, and we'll come back to that, but just keep it in mind for now, and I think you'll see why I brought it up by the time we get to the Joker, because that really does sum up this movie perfectly. So the movie starts with Arthur putting on his clown makeup. And we hear the radio in the background giving us a news report telling us about the state of the city, which is pretty bleak. There's a garbage strike, there's rats everywhere, businesses are going under. The city is not in great shape. We find out that there's a lot of unemployment, and although Arthur is employed, it's not a great job, and he's pretty much on the bottom rung of society, as we soon learn. We next see Arthur dressed as the clown, working in the street. He's waving a sign around which says "Everything must go," which is kind of relevant to the theme of the movie, but also demonstrates that the city really is going to shit. And some youths come along and steal the sign. Arthur chases them, and they beat him over the head with the sign and kick the shit out of him. Once again, this is really symbolic for life. This is what life has always done to Arthur, as we learn. It's always kicked the shit out of him. It's always treated him bad. It's always held him down. And the poor guy's never had a break. And I'm pretty sure this isn't the first beating he's ever taken. In fact, a bit later we learn that it most definitely is not. So following that, we learn that Arthur has a mental illness. I guess it's kind of like Tourette's. Every time he gets nervous, he laughs uncontrollably. It's something he can't stop. He actually carries cards with him so he can give to people to, explain to them that he has a mental issue. He's not actually laughing at them or whatever. This isn't the only mental condition that he has, and we see him talking to his social worker. He says to her, "Is it me or is it getting crazy out there?" Once again, really summing up the state of the city and the fact that everything's going to shit. She wants to see his mental health journal, which he hands over to her, and it's filled with his scribblings. He's filled it with jokes and things like that, and he explains to her that he wants to be a stand-up comedian. And this kind of makes sense for the character. He's been beaten down his entire life. He just wants to make people laugh, so they like him and accept him. He's looking for acceptance and some kind of sympathy at this point. And he really hasn't got it at any point in his life, as we learn. So the social worker stops on a particular page and reads some words that Arthur has written. They say, "I hope my death makes more sense than my life." So here we have a man who is suicidal. who really doesn't see any point in living. Life is a struggle for him every single day. She asks him if seeing her and talking is helping him, and he says that he thinks he felt better when he was locked up in the mental hospital. Now, we never learn why he was locked up in the mental hospital. We just see a quick flash of him in the mental hospital. But I guess being in there gave him some sense of structure and maybe security, and maybe it wasn't as cruel to him as the outside world is. So he asks her if the doctors can increase his medication. And we learn that he's on 7 different types of medication, and the social worker says, surely they must be doing something. And his only reply is, I just don't want to feel bad anymore. So I have to say, you would have to be fucking inhuman not to have some kind of sympathy or empathy for this poor guy. He's never had a break. He's never had any sense of security or affection or validation by anyone, despite the fact that he's a white male, which is supposedly meant to make him, I don't know, a king or something, meant to have some type of privilege, and therefore we're not meant to have any sympathy for him. Strange. I don't really get it, but anyway. So on the way home, Arthur is sitting behind a mother and her young child, and Arthur starts pulling funny faces to make the child laugh. Now once again, this shows us that he really does have a good heart, at least at this point, and he likes making children laugh, as we will see a little bit later. In fact, it's probably one of the only forms of validation he's ever gotten in his life. Not that it's really much, not that it's really enough to support him emotionally. Of course, the mother turns around and scolds him for this. This makes Arthur very anxious, and he starts to laugh uncontrollably, which makes her just think that he's crazy. He tries to stop laughing, but he can't, and he hands her a card explaining his condition. After he gets off the bus, we see him climbing many steps, and we see this a couple of times in the early part of the movie. It's out in public, it's on the way to his apartment, and there's just a huge flight of steps, and we see him slowly climbing up. Each step is torture. It's an effort to make. It's like the weight of the world is weighing down on his shoulders. He's very much like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill, only to have it roll down again, because it's pretty clear he does this day in, day out, and life is just wearing him down, and climbing these stairs is a very visual way of showing that. It shows the drain on him, the weight on his shoulders. Now, when Arthur gets home, we learn that he lives with his elderly mother. Now, if this was the Woker instead of the Joker, if this was a female character who was looking after an elderly relative, the same people who condemn this movie would be saying that she's a victim because it's society's expectation that she take care of an elderly person. This wouldn't be an expectation put on males. She's sacrificing herself for her family. We should have sympathy for her. We should have empathy for her. But because this isn't the Woker, because this is the Joker, instead, those same people see Arthur as a loser. In fact, living in your mother's basement is a common insult they use towards MRAs and other groups that they dislike. Now, this insult is very telling because it actually reinforces traditional gender roles. It's basically saying that if you're not a provider, protector as a male, then you're a fucking loser. Now, this is rather a complex thing, and I'm not going to go into it in any great detail here, but women are born with an innate value. This is because of reproduction. Eggs are rare, sperm is plentiful. To simplify this, a woman can only have one pregnancy in 9 months, whereas a man can get numerous women pregnant in 9 months. So essentially a society can survive with less men, but it can't survive with less women. This is where male disposability comes from. But it also puts an innate value on females. This is why we see mothers as a full-time job and fathers as a part-time job, if that, more often than not just as a wallet. We see being a mum as an achievement, but being a father isn't really an achievement. He's someone who just has to pay the bills. So women are born with an innate value because they can be mothers, but men have to earn their value. They have to prove their value by being successful, which is why people like Arthur are seen as losers. And that's why a female in that same position would not be judged in the same way. So we learn that Arthur's mother worked for the Waynes for many years, and she's been writing Thomas Wayne, which is Bruce Wayne's father, just in case you don't know much about Batman. And Thomas Wayne hasn't written back, and she's waiting for him to write back. And Arthur and his mother sit down to watch TV. And the program that comes on TV is a show called Tonight with Murray Franklin, played by Robert De Niro. Now, Murray Franklin, I guess, is kind of like Dave Letterman, you know, that type of late night show. I've probably confused some of the millennials out there. Lucky I didn't say Johnny Carson, because that really would have confused them. But anyway, it's a late night talk show, and we see Arthur fantasizing about being in the audience of this Tonight Show. And he says something to catch Murray's attention, and Murray calls him up on stage. And they chat, and Arthur is confident and impressive in his fantasy, and Murray comments to him that he wishes he had a son like Arthur. And once again, this is very, very important because Arthur doesn't have a dad. He never had a father figure. He never had that male role model that he could emulate. And it's pretty clear that he's looking for that role model somewhere else. That's why he's fantasizing about this celebrity, Murray Franklin, choosing him and commenting how he would have made a good son, giving him validation. That's something that he's lacking, that he's never had in his life. Once again, Arthur is a tragic character. He's someone we should have sympathy for. He's someone we should understand and care about and feel sorry for, despite the fact that he's white and male, which apparently, you know, makes him the spawn of Satan. I didn't know this until I started reading the toxic articles written by toxic journalists, but apparently that's the way it works. Now, I don't think this fantasy is in itself a bad thing. I think it's perfectly natural to fantasize about something that you don't have or something that you want, especially something like a father and validation and a role model. You know, all these things which, unfortunately, so many young boys are missing these days. So I think his fantasy is a perfectly natural thing to do. Unfortunately, as we see a bit later, because of Arthur's many issues, the boundaries between what is fantasy and what is reality start to get a little bit blurred. Well, totally blurred. And that's a problem. So the next day at work, a co-worker gives Arthur a pistol because he's heard that he got beaten up, so he gives him the gun for self-protection. Arthur is also called into the boss's office and is reprimanded for leaving work early. Now, Arthur tries to explain that it wasn't his fault that the sign was stolen and that he chased the guys who stole the sign and they beat him up, but the boss doesn't want to hear it. This is just another person in Arthur's life that doesn't want to hear what he has to say, doesn't want to listen, and just ends up speaking over him. And on top of that, the boss tells him that if he doesn't return the sign, he's going to have to pay for it. The boss also makes it pretty clear that the other workers there think he's weird and don't like being around him. And Arthur's only reaction is to smile submissively, although you can see underneath that there is anger. And we see this anger in the next scene when he's out in the alley and he's kicking the shit out of a dumpster. He was too afraid to fully speak up. He tried, but got spoken over. So he takes his anger out on an inanimate object out in the alleyway. And then once again at the end of the day, we see Arthur climbing those stairs, one step at a time, the weight of the world on his shoulders weighing him down, each step being a strain. Back at his apartment, Arthur bathes his mother, and once again she brings up not receiving a letter from Thomas Wayne yet. She clearly sees Thomas Wayne as some type of saviour who is going to come and save them from the poverty that they're in. Sometime after that, while watching TV, Arthur is playing with the gun and it accidentally goes off. And his mother, yells from the other room, "What was that?" And he makes an excuse that it was the TV. So the next day, Arthur follows and spies on an attractive young neighbour of his. He follows her around, watching her from a distance. And sometime after that, he goes to a comedy act and once again laughs uncontrollably, usually at points where the audience isn't laughing. He's also taking many, many notes. Sometime later, when he's at home, he hears a knock at the door. And when he answers the door, it's that attractive young neighbour. Now, Arthur is very different here. He's joking and acting confident, which tells us that this isn't reality. This is just another fantasy. He's fantasizing about being confident and being able to speak to her and joke and laugh without, being uncomfortable or laughing uncontrollably. And I don't think there's anything wrong with fantasizing about something like that, except when that fantasy creeps into reality and you can't tell the difference between the two. And we learn that's what's happening with Arthur. The movie gives us the impression that he's actually dating this woman from now on, although we find out much later on that that's not the case, that it's all been a fantasy, and he hasn't been able to tell the difference between the two. The next day, Arthur goes to work, and this day he's working at a hospital, to be more specific, a children's hospital, and he's dressed as a clown, and he's making them laugh, and he seems really happy doing this. I think this is one of the few moments in his life where he has any type of joy. He really seems to like making children laugh. And he seems fairly good at it too. I don't think the children are judging him the same way that adults do. But unfortunately for Arthur, he fucks up. He took the gun with him. It falls out and slides across the floor. And, you really can't take a gun to a children's hospital and expect to keep your job. And that's what happens. You see him on the phone shortly after pleading with his boss not to fire him. And his boss fires him. And, I can't blame his boss for doing this. But at the same time, I have to feel sorry for Arthur, because this is probably the one thing in his life where he got some positive validation from children laughing at him. Not to mention, it's his only source of income. So, as you might imagine, this is a devastating blow. So at this point, Arthur is not having a good day. He's just been fired from his job, and he's now on his way home on the train. Up the other end of the carriage are three drunk men in suits who are hassling a woman sitting by herself. Arthur is watching as this unfolds, and because of his mental health issue, he starts to laugh uncontrollably. This gets the attention of the men. The woman manages to get up and leave, and the three men come down and start hassling Arthur. One of which grabs the clown wig thing that he's got on and pulls it off. And it's interesting because from this point on, we never see Arthur wear that again whenever he's in clown makeup. This is because this is the start of his transformation from Arthur into the Joker. So Arthur just keeps laughing because he can't help it. He's nervous, he's in a threatened state, and his response is to laugh. And of course, these guys don't understand that. They think he's being a smartass to them, so they beat the shit out of him. And while he's down on the floor of the train being kicked, he pulls out his gun and shoots one of them. And then he shoots the second one. Now, at this point, you could argue it's self-defense. But as the train pulls into a station, the third guy manages to get out of the carriage, and Arthur chases him down and shoots him. Now, at first, Arthur's in a bit of shock, and you can tell that adrenaline is flowing through his system. But this is most likely the first time he has ever had any sense of power or control, unfortunately, and he likes it. This is a guy who's been beat down his whole life, who has been talked down to, who has never been listened to, who has never had any power or influence on his life or on anything else, on the world outside. And now he has power. In this instance, he has gained a great sense of power and control. Unfortunately. I say unfortunately because obviously there are much more productive ways he could have done that. Killing people really isn't a good way to, gain control over your life. It's a bit unfortunate he didn't read Jordan Peterson's book. I'm pretty sure one of the rules in that wasn't kill 3 guys on the subway. So we see Arthur head towards his home, and it's interesting that we don't see him climbing those steps on his way home. In fact, I don't think we see him climbing those steps for the rest of the movie. Once again, this is because Arthur, as we saw in the first part of this review, in the first part of the movie, is now fading away. He is transforming into the Joker. So we don't see that climb up the steps with the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. Now, he's not there yet. This is just the start of that transformation. And when he gets into the elevator, we see him do a little bit of a dance. This is our first hint of the Joker. This is the first taste of freedom that Arthur has ever had. His dance is elegant and free, as opposed to what we saw in the first part of the movie where the weight of the world was weighing him down. As he comes out of the elevator, he walks down the hall and he knocks on the door of his neighbour and goes in and kisses her. Now, obviously this part is fantasy, but once again, fantasy and reality is blurred to Arthur. Not a healthy situation. So the next day, Arthur goes to work and he's cleaning out his locker. And his now ex-co-workers are teasing him about taking a gun to a children's hospital. But Arthur has changed a bit. We can see that change as opposed to the first part of the movie. He's now talking back. He's now a bit more of a smartass. He now has some more confidence. And as he's leaving, he punches the time clock off the wall, laughing the whole time. And when he's leaving the building, he crosses out the words "forget to" on the "don't forget the smile" sign, so it reads "don't smile." Once again, this is just an indicator of the transformation that Arthur is going through, and he dances down the stairs as he leaves. Later on, back at home, Arthur's mother is watching TV and Thomas Wayne is on TV again. And Thomas is defending the 3 murdered drunk men, the 3 men that Arthur killed last night. And he calls the murderer a coward, which Arthur clearly doesn't like. Later on, Arthur sees his social worker again. He says to her, "Until a little while ago, it's like no one ever saw me. It's like I never existed." And that sums up the first part of the movie perfectly, the Arthur segment. No one saw him. No one gave a shit about him. He was insignificant to everyone and to the world. But there has been a change in him. She starts to tell him that she has some bad news. But before she can finish, Arthur interrupts her. He says, "You don't listen, do you? I don't think you have ever listened. You just ask the same questions every week. How's your job? Are you having any negative thoughts? All I have are negative thoughts. But you don't listen anyway. I said for my whole life I didn't know if I ever really existed. But I do, and people are starting to notice." Once again, this is the start of his transformation into the Joker. His social worker responds by telling him that they're cutting funding and that this is the last time she'll ever be able to see him. She says they don't really give a shit about people like you, Arthur, and they don't really give a shit about people like me either. Arthur asks where he's meant to get his meds from now on. The next scene is Arthur at a comedy club. He goes on stage for the first time. Let's just say it doesn't go very well. He's introduced as someone who from a young age wanted to bring laughter and joy into the cold, dark world. This is an element from Arthur from the first part of the movie, something which is now fading away as he transforms into the Joker. Once on stage, due to his nervousness, he just starts laughing uncontrollably. Needless to say, this doesn't go down too well. And the more he laughs, the more nervous he gets. And the more nervous he gets, the more he laughs, and he can't gain control over it. It's just out of control. The audience is dead silent. But then he sees the attractive young neighbour sitting in the audience, smiling at him. And suddenly Arthur gains confidence and he's able to stop laughing and he starts reading his jokes. The audience cheers and claps. Now obviously at this point Arthur has slipped into the fantasy world again. This is not reality. Speaking of fantasy, later on we see Arthur and the attractive young neighbour walking down the street. Arthur is distracted by a newspaper which has a headline about the killer clown on the subway. Arthur's drawn to it, and the attractive young neighbour notices this and refers to the guy as a hero. Once again, obviously this is all fantasy. When Arthur gets home, he finds his mother passed out on the couch watching TV. He wakes her up and puts her to bed. He then finds a letter that she's written to Thomas Wayne, and Arthur reads it. Arthur discovers that Thomas Wayne is actually his father. This obviously puts Arthur into a rage. Arthur's mother tells him that they were very much in love, but Thomas Wayne is a very powerful man and it wouldn't have been good publicity for everyone to know that he was having an affair and had a bastard son, basically. So Arthur has now found a father figure, but it's a father figure which has neglected him and rejected him. Not only has he ignored Arthur for Arthur's entire life, but he rejected him on TV in just a few scenes earlier. That is, he rejected the murderer of the three guys on the subway. He's rejecting what is unfortunately the high point in Arthur's life, the one point in which he had any kind of self-control or power over the world. So this is very different than the fantasy that we saw at the start, where Arthur was fantasizing that Murray Franklin would, see him as a son and become a father figure to him. He thinks he's found his actual father, only his father is nothing but rejection. So the next day, Arthur travels to Wayne Manor, where he sees a young Bruce Wayne playing near the fence. Arthur's wearing his clown makeup and interacts with the young Bruce Wayne. It's an interesting scene because we know that one day Bruce Wayne would become Batman and these two would be enemies. A man comes out and puts a stop to this. I'm guessing the man is Alfred. And once Alfred learns who Arthur is, he tells him that his mother was delusional. This doesn't go down very well with Arthur, needless to say. When Arthur gets home, he finds that his mother is being taken to the hospital. It appears that she's had a stroke. At the hospital, two cops question him about the subway killing. Now, it's an interesting point here that even though Arthur is clearly nervous when he's talking to the cops, he doesn't laugh uncontrollably. He leaves without really answering any of their questions. We see Arthur waiting by the hospital bed of his mother with the attractive young neighbour, who obviously isn't there because this is part of his delusion. We know this because she leaves just before the next part of the scene. And that's when Murray Franklin comes on the TV. And Murray Franklin has a tape of Arthur's comedy performance at the comedy club, where he's laughing uncontrollably. And Murray Franklin plays this and makes fun of it. And we see anger on Arthur's face. So he's now been rejected by his fantasy father, as well as the man he thinks is his real father. Not good. Back at home later on, Arthur is watching a news report on the TV, and we see many protesters dressed as clowns inspired by the clown killer on the subway. One of these people dressed as a clown is interviewed. He says, "Fuck Thomas Wayne, fuck the system." Arthur smiles. So Arthur goes to the theatre where Thomas Wayne and his family are in attendance. There's a massive protest out the front with people dressed as clowns. And Arthur manages to sneak in the back and waits until Thomas Wayne goes into the bathroom by himself, and that's when Arthur confronts him. He tells Thomas Wayne that he knows that he's his father, and of course Thomas Wayne denies it. He says that Arthur's mother is delusional. She made the whole thing up. They never slept together, and that he's definitely not Arthur's father. Arthur, of course, doesn't believe him. He's finally found a father, and this father is just denying it, which obviously is fueling Arthur's anger. But Thomas Wayne tells him he couldn't be his father. Not only did he not sleep with Arthur's mother, but Arthur's mother also adopted him. Now, this is news to Arthur. He had no idea he was adopted, and he doesn't take the news all that well, which is perfectly understandable. Thomas Wayne also tells him that his mother spent time in a mental hospital and had abused him as a child. Once again, this is news to Arthur. This threatens any structures that he has kind of constructed in his life. Not that there are many, but any sense of self or who he was or who he is threatened by this. Arthur's nervous laughter returns, and Thomas Wayne responds by hitting him, not understanding that, it's a nervous condition. Once back at home, Arthur pulls everything out of the fridge and climbs in. I'm guessing this is an attempt to escape from the world and, maybe take some shelter from the world or something like that. And while in the fridge, he gets a phone call from the two cops, which goes to the answering machine. He obviously doesn't answer it. But he then gets a call from the Murray Franklin show, and they want him to come on. Now, obviously they don't want him to come on because they think he's a good comedian. They want him to come on so they can make fun of him, take advantage of him, basically. So once again, this is his fantasized father figure wanting to take advantage of him and make fun of him, as opposed to give him the validation that he needs and craves. So Arthur needs to find out whether he's really adopted or not, and whether his mother was actually in the mental hospital or not. So he goes to Arkham Asylum, and he's talking to the filing clerk, and once again we see the Joker that will appear in the third part of this review poke through, and he confesses to the filing clerk, "Sometimes I don't know what to do. Last time I ended up taking it out on some people. I thought it was going to bother me, but it really hasn't. I fucked up and did some bad shit. You know what I'm talking about. It's so hard trying to be happy all the time." Once again, this is a further step along on his transformation into the Joker. He's slowly discarding all the parts of him which are Arthur and transforming into something new. So he manages to steal the files from the clerk, and he reads that he was indeed adopted, so Thomas Wayne could not be his father, although there is a theory out on the internet that maybe Thomas Wayne, paid to have this false information put in the file or something like that. And the file also says that his mother was seriously mentally ill, and she and her boyfriends abused Arthur when he was a boy. This is obviously the root of all his issues, especially considering he had serious trauma to the head. This leaves Arthur laughing uncontrollably, and the laughter is almost like weeping. On his way home, he's drenched in rain, which really is a visual of his mood. And when he's in the elevator, the attractive young neighbour's there, and she puts her hand to her head, shaped like a gun, and pretends to pull the trigger. This is obviously fantasy, an hallucination from Arthur, and clearly at this point he's pretty fucking suicidal. He gets out of the elevator and walks down the hall and goes into the attractive young neighbour's apartment. He sits down and starts watching TV. She comes out, and needless to say, she's quite shocked that this neighbour who she's never really talked to is sitting in her lounge room watching TV. She says, "What are you doing here? You're in the wrong apartment." And this is the point where Arthur suddenly realises that their entire relationship was just a fantasy. It wasn't real. Now, I thought this was pretty evident right from the start. Maybe it fooled some people, I don't know. But I thought the changes in Arthur's personality when he was interacting with her clearly demonstrated that it was a fantasy right from the start. But needless to say, this is a devastating blow to Arthur. He's basically lost everything at this point. Not that he had really anything to begin with, but any notion of family he had with his mother is now gone. The idea that he had a relationship with someone who cared for him is now gone. The fantasy father figure is just interested in making fun of him. And the person who he thought was his real father for a short time turns out isn't, and is also a massive asshole. So the question is, what does he have left? And the answer is nothing. He has nothing left.
Freedom is just
Now, normal people have numerous structures in their life to support them. The most obvious one would probably be family. Most people have some family, be it, mother, father, brother, sister, cousins, aunties, uncles, grandparents, wife or husband or children or whatever, right? Some form of family who is some form of support. Not everyone has this, but most people in society have it to some degree. And then there's friends. Most people have friends, at least to some degree, who are supportive, who you can talk to, who will help you out, who will give you advice, who will tell you when you're fucking up, who will give you some form of validation. And then there's relationships. Now, I'm not suggesting that men in particular should get their validation from relationships. I'm fully supportive of the MGTOW notion of men getting their self-worth from themselves. I think that's very healthy. But realistically, for someone like Arthur, finding a good woman who could actually see the good in him and give him some form of validation would have been a good thing for him. Now, I do say a good woman because there are plenty of bad ones who could have made him much, much worse. But a good supportive woman who saw, the good elements in him and encouraged him to be the best he could be, that could have saved him. That could have been one of the things to save him. Same with community groups. Some kind of social group. Maybe they get together over a common interest or a sport or even religion, although once again, that's not always healthy. Someone like Arthur could easily be taken advantage of and brought into a cult, but the more benign types of religious groups, community religious groups, could have been supportive. And that's coming from an atheist, remember. And even work could have been some kind of validation or support. If he had have found a career which he could have been successful at and taken pride and joy in, something he could have achieved, that could have given him a sense of validation and achievement. And then, of course, we have government structures, which clearly in this movie let him down. Not only were they underfunded, but they weren't really interested in listening to him, which isn't entirely their fault. I imagine the social worker was overwhelmed with cases and really stretched to a limit, but it wasn't really much help to him at all. If anything, it might have made him worse. So all these structures are there to support normal people, and we are social animals, and we do need some kind of social support and validation and acknowledgement and community. Arthur had none of this. He didn't have the slightest bit of it. His one family member who he took care of turned out to be the cause of all his issues. He had no friends. He had no love life. He had no social groups to support him. He had no career to give him validation, except, maybe the children's hospital thing, but he fucked that up. But he definitely wasn't going to make it as a comedian. And the government network also let him down. So he had nothing. He has absolutely nothing. How do you expect him to turn out? When you give someone absolutely nothing, what makes you think that they're going to act by society's rules? Now, the reality is most people under those circumstances just end up killing themselves, which is why there's such a high male suicide rate. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that, but some of the issues we see in this movie are some major issues contributing to the male suicide rate. Not to mention drug addiction and alcohol addiction and numerous other things. But a small percentage of those people, instead of taking it out on themselves and killing themselves, turn around and take it out on society. They're kind of like a dog which has been kicked their entire life, and the dog normally cowers in the corner with its tail between its legs. But then one day, the dog bites back. That's basically Arthur. When he confronted the three men on the train and defended himself, that was that cowering dog biting back for the first time, and it gave him a sense of power and control which he'd never had before, and he liked it. That sense that most people take for granted, he had for the very first time in that moment. Now obviously most people don't get it from murdering three people on a train, We get it from all those other things that I mentioned earlier. But for Arthur, that was the only sense of power and control he ever had. And he's now come to the realization that he's had absolutely nothing in his life. Nothing to support him, nothing to live for. And in that realization, it's given him a sense of freedom. And this has led to his transformation into the Joker. So Arthur has lost any hope for the future. He doesn't really care what happens now. He doesn't care about acceptance from society anymore, or the validation of others. That's all gone. He's literally got nothing left to lose, and that's given him a sense of freedom. He's no longer restricted by trying to please others, or by being accepted by others. He literally just doesn't give a shit anymore, and this gives him a sense of freedom. Any restrictions or restraints which society may have placed on him no longer exist, which makes him extremely dangerous. And the first thing Arthur does is go and visit his mother. He tells her, "You know, you used to tell me that my laugh was a condition, that there was something wrong with me. There isn't. That's the real me. Happy? I haven't been happy one day of my entire fucking life. You know what's funny? You know what really makes me laugh? I used to think that my life was a tragedy, but now I realize it's a fucking comedy." And then he smothers his mother with a pillow. Back at Arthur's apartment, he watches tapes of the Murray Franklin show, and he practices coming out on stage and sitting down and chatting to Murray Franklin. And he says, "Do you want to hear a joke? Knock knock." And then he pulls out his gun and puts it under his chin and pulls the trigger. Now obviously the gun isn't loaded at this point, but we see that he's practicing to commit suicide live on air in front of Murray Franklin. This is, I guess, the ultimate fuck you, right? Because he literally doesn't care anymore. Doesn't give a shit what happens to him. He literally has nothing left to lose, not even his life. We then see him putting on his makeup and he dyes his hair green. And from this point on, I'm just going to refer to him as the Joker, because Arthur is dead. Arthur is gone at this point. Arthur has fully transformed into the Joker. Two of his former workmates turn up at his door, one of which is the guy who gave him the gun. They ask about the makeup and whether he's got another gig as a clown. He says no, so they ask if he's going to the protest, and he says, "No, my mum died. I'm celebrating." He tells them that he stopped taking his medication and that he's feeling a lot better now. And then he brutally murders the guy that gave him the gun. But he does let the other guy go because he was actually kind to Arthur. So the Joker gives him, I guess, some mercy and lets him go without killing him. He was probably the closest thing that Arthur had to a friend. Not that they were really close. Now that Arthur has been fully transformed into the Joker, he moves differently. He moves with grace. He moves with confidence. He's carefree, that the weight of the world that was on Arthur's shoulders is now gone. And we see this when the Joker is coming down the stairs that I referred to earlier on in this review. The stairs that Arthur slowly walked up each night after work with the weight of the world on him, and each step was a struggle. Now that he's become the Joker, he dances down the stairs, carefree, without any restrictions, without any worries. The two cops which have been trying to question him call out to him from behind, and he runs and makes his way to the subway. They follow him on the subway, and he manages to get away. But in doing so, one of the cops accidentally shoots one of the protesters because the train is filled with protesters, and there's basically a riot on the train, and the cops get the shit beaten out of them and almost killed. So the Joker turns up to the green room at the Murray Franklin show, and he meets Murray Franklin, and Murray says, "What's with the clown face? Are you part of the protest?" And the Joker replies, "No, I don't believe in anything." Once again, he's let go of everything. He has nothing to restrict him. He doesn't believe in anything. He doesn't care about anything. And that's why he is so free. That's what makes him so dangerous. The Joker tells Murray that he wants to be introduced as the Joker, because that's what Murray had called him on air. A short time later, Murray plays the stand-up clip again and then introduces the Joker. He dances out on stage, filled with confidence, completely different to the Arthur that we saw at the start of this movie. Murray is a little bit surprised by this and says, "Are you okay?" And the Joker replies, "This is exactly how I imagined it." Murray says, "Can you tell us a joke?" And the Joker starts flipping through his mental health diary, which has all his jokes written in it. He eventually stops on a page and says, "Here's one. Knock, knock." Murray says, "Who's there?" The Joker says, "It's the police, ma'am. Your son has been hit by a drunk driver. He's dead." The audience isn't very impressed by this, let's say. And neither is Murray. But this is the Joker's way of saying, fuck you. You know, I don't care if you're offended. Whereas Arthur wanted nothing but acceptance and nothing but to please. The Joker doesn't care. Doesn't give a shit. Murray says, "That's not funny. That's not the kind of humour we do on this show." And the Joker says, "It's been a rough couple of weeks, Murray. Ever since I killed those couple of Wall Street guys." Everyone is dead silent. Murray says, "Okay, I'm waiting for the punchline." The Joker says, "There is no punchline. It's not a joke." Murray says, "Why should we believe you?" And the Joker says, "Because I've got nothing left to lose. I don't care anymore. My life is nothing but a comedy." Like I said, this is what makes him so incredibly dangerous. Murray asks him if he thinks killing those guys was funny. The Joker says he does. Murray asks if it was part of the movement to become a symbol. The Joker answers, "Do I look like the type of clown who could start a movement? I killed those guys because they were awful. Everybody is awful these days. It's enough to make anyone crazy." The audience boos. The Joker says, "Why is everyone so upset about these guys? If it was me dying on the sidewalk, you'd walk right over me. I pass you every day and you don't notice me. But these guys? Why? Because Thomas Wayne cried about them on TV? Have you seen what it's like out there, Murray? Do you ever leave the studio? Everybody just yells and screams at each other. Nobody's civil anymore. Nobody thinks what it's like to be the other guy. Do you ever think men like Thomas Wayne ever think what it's like to be someone like me? To be someone but themselves? They don't. They think we'll just sit there and take it like good little boys. That we won't werewolf and go wild." Murray asks if he's finished. Murray's getting rather pissed off at this point. The Joker then accuses Murray of being awful, of playing his video and inviting him on the show just to make fun of him. That he's just like the rest of them. And then he says, "How about another joke, Murray?" Murray tries to shut him down, but the Joker says, "What do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and treats him like trash? I tell you what you get. You get what you fucking deserve." At which point the Joker pulls out the gun and shoots Murray dead. The audience obviously goes into a panic. The Joker sits there for a moment laughing. He then stands up, shoots Murray again, and does a little dance. We next see the Joker in the back of a police car. Gotham has erupted into riots. He laughs at the chaos as he drives by. Suddenly the police car is sideswiped by an ambulance. Protesters in clown masks free the Joker from the back of the police car. Nearby, the Waynes leave the theatre and cut down a back alleyway to avoid the riots. And Thomas and Martha Wayne are murdered by a rioter in a clown mask. Meanwhile, the Joker wakes up on the police car. Standing on top of it, the rioters cheer him. The final scene is the Joker handcuffed in a mental hospital, laughing to himself. His psychiatrist asks him, "What's so funny?" The Joker says, "You wouldn't get it." So this should be a warning to everyone. When you give a certain segment of society nothing left to lose, nothing to live for, most of them will take their own lives. Most of them will just commit suicide, but a small number will go a different route. They will take it out on society. And from their perspective, why should they care about other people if society doesn't care about them? There are three things that keep people under control in society. The first one is morality, and that can be broken down fairly simply as do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. As a general rule, people don't steal because they don't like their stuff being stolen. People don't beat or murder other people because they don't want to be beaten or murdered. But morality doesn't really work on someone who has been beaten down their entire life, who is convinced, with good reason, that society doesn't give two shits about him. If society doesn't give two shits about him, why should he give two shits about anyone else? The second thing that keeps people under control in society is motivation to improve your life. This might be, to get a good job, to have a career, maybe to have a family, maybe, buy things that you like, maybe travel, spend time on a hobby, be social with friends, things like that. Once again, Arthur doesn't have any of these things. He doesn't have anything to look forward to. His life is hell. Every day it's the same fucking hell. And there's little hope that it's ever going to get better. Maybe if he had some help, some actual help from someone, from anyone, it could improve. But it's not going to by itself. And he doesn't know how to improve it by himself. So he's trapped, and things aren't going to get better. They're literally just going to get worse. Despite this, I think early on, when he was still Arthur, before he became the Joker, he was holding on to the hope that maybe one day he would have a happy life, that maybe one day he would have those things. He'd have validation and be cared for and maybe have a career. But that was taken from him. And he reached the point where he didn't care if he lived or died. So what motivation does he have to obey the rules? And then thirdly, the third thing that keeps people under control in society is fear of punishment. People don't want to go to jail, or in those states that have the death penalty, they don't want to be killed. This is pointless to someone who is suicidal and basically wants to die, especially if they want to commit suicide by cop. And to be honest, the mental institution would probably give Arthur more structure than society, so it's probably not much of a punishment when you think about it. So when Arthur realizes he doesn't have any of these things to restrict him, he lets go. And when he lets go, that's when he becomes the Joker. So what does this movie have to do with men's rights, if anything? Well, there's lots of conversations we could be having. First of all, we could be talking about male suicide. Now, it is true no one in the movie actually commits suicide, but Arthur is clearly suicidal. And if he hadn't transformed into the Joker, then in all likelihood he would have killed himself at some point. And I don't think he was destined to become the Joker. If those kids at the start hadn't stolen his sign and beat him up, then his workmate wouldn't have given him the gun, which means he wouldn't have been fired, which means he wouldn't have been on the train when the guys were there, which means he wouldn't have been beaten up by them, which means he wouldn't have shot them, which means he wouldn't have started his transformation into the Joker. And in all likelihood, he would have just gone on the way he was, his life being absolute hell, until one day he would probably commit suicide. There's also a conversation we could be having here about the fact that he was lacking a father figure and desperate for one. And as I said earlier in this video, there are many boys in that situation these days. We could also be talking about the family breakdown, because the only family support he had was from his mentally ill and abusive mother. Speaking of which, do you think a man who was mentally ill and abused his child, his 3-year-old child, would get custody of him once he came out of a mental hospital? The answer is no. No, that man would not get custody of that child. Yet we see unfit mothers get custody all the time. That's another men's rights conversation we could be having in relation to this movie. And of course there's social isolation and the empathy gap. Now, I'm not going to suggest that social isolation only affects men or only affects white men, but I do think we're less empathetic towards men, and in particular aspects of the media are less empathetic towards white men in particular. This comes from the whole narrative that if you're white and you're male, you automatically have a a golden ticket, you automatically have privilege. And although that's true in some cases, it's definitely not true in all cases. In fact, it's not true in the vast majority of cases. Obviously, not everyone is Thomas Wayne. That's what's called the apex fallacy. So I do think there's also a conversation we could be having here about how aspects of the toxic media like to dismiss men's issues, especially white men, especially straight white men, because apparently straight white men aren't supposed to have any issues whatsoever. And just to be clear, so no one takes me out of context, I'm not suggesting that only men or only white men or only straight white men have issues, or that those issues are worse than any other group or anything like that. I'm simply making the point that there are aspects of the media which will dismiss those issues automatically based on the fact that someone's male or someone's white or someone's straight, and will in fact use those things as an excuse to not only dismiss any issues that that person may have, but to actually demonize that person. And when you start teaching school children that masculinity is toxic, it's not going to help people like Arthur. It's not going to help people who already have issues to teach them that they're toxic on top of that. You're reinforcing their issues. You're making it harder for them to deal with their issues. And surely our society would be better if we had sympathy and empathy for everyone, regardless of their race or gender or sexual orientation. But apparently suggesting that would make me a bigot, right? That's the world we're living in now. Needless to say, none of this has the slightest thing to do with toxic masculinity or male entitlement. Suggesting Arthur has male entitlement because he wants basic human decency and compassion is like saying someone has male entitlement because they want clean drinking water, or something equally as stupid.
Men are good. Yes. I want to say that again. Men are good. That's not the message we've been hearing for 40, 50 years. And in fact, it's not the message that I got when I was at a counseling center. I just got out of grad school. I thought, I want to go do some good work. I get to this counseling center, and what do I find? I find there's 17 therapists there. 16 were women, and 1 was a guy. That was me. So what would they do? They'd send all the men to me. Because what were the women saying? The women were saying things like, men don't grieve. Men aren't dealing with their feelings. They're stuffing all this stuff, right? Have you heard those lines before? How many men in this audience have heard that? You're not dealing with your feelings. Yeah, well, I'm here to tell you that we're going to talk about how you, in fact, probably are dealing with it, but you're dealing with it in ways that people don't know about yet, because really it's been pushed underneath. You can't even see it. But it's out there. And it took me about 30 years to figure it out. And I'm going to summarize in about 30 seconds what it took me 30 years to figure out. And that is this. In general, men will tend to heal themselves through an action or an inaction, pulling back and being quiet, that uses honoring and pulls them into the future. I'll say that again. Men will tend to use action or inaction and honoring within those two things to pull them into the future. And through that, what do? They heal. Now, you can see why that really was unseeable at the time, because our culture pretends that the only way to heal is through what? Talking about it and crying, right? Oh my gosh. You know, when I got out of grad school, right? I go to work, I sit down with these guys, and I make good eye contact, just like they taught me in grad school, right? You make good eye contact. Do men like eye contact? No, not in the same way as women like eye contact. With the women clients I have, it was great. I could tell they relaxed, they felt close. But with the men, I felt like I was making them nervous. And of course, now I know what's happening. You know, men with another man, eye contact does not mean connection and intimacy. It means something else. What does it mean? Challenge. It means put them up. Hockey has a face-off. Boxers face each other, right? This is a challenge. This is not something that's going to make him feel safe and like, oh, now I can talk about the past. No. Hell no. You know, what I found out, of course, since then was the honoring and action, but men do it shoulder to shoulder. They're much more likely to do something shoulder to shoulder with each other. Men will sit in a fishing boat all day, shoulder to shoulder. They'll leave that fishing boat after the day. They'll feel close to that guy, but they didn't say one word. Words are not that critical. It's something else that's critical to men. In fact, sometimes I think, that this masculine way of intimacy, of being close through just being with, is really in some ways more developed than just a lot of talk. But that's my bias. Maybe it's not yours. Anyway. It is. So I got the message that, men were not such good things because they couldn't deal with their feelings so much. And it took me this 30 years to come and tell you what I just told you, and we're going to talk about the different ways they do that later on. But the first thing I want to talk about is, why could I not see it at the time? Why could I not see the way these men were healing? What was it that blinded me, and what was it that made it invisible so we couldn't see the men's pain? And the very first thing is, a man's pain is taboo. A man's pain is taboo. You've heard speakers all day today talk about that in certain ways, but a man's pain is taboo. No one wants to touch it. No one wants to hear it. And men are not dumb. They know that. So what are they going to do? Go emote in public? No. They know their pain is taboo. Now, let's do an exercise. I want you to imagine that you're walking into your favorite restaurant. You're walking in your favorite restaurant, and you're walking in to get seated, you're thinking, and you look over in the corner, at the corner table, there's a woman. She's crying. What's the first thing you think about with her? Anybody? What's wrong? Poor dear, she's upset, right? I've asked this question to thousands of therapists in the workshops I give. I'm telling you, they all say the same thing. Poor dear, she must have just broken up with someone. She needs support. How can I help, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Erase that image. Go back, you're walking into the same restaurant. You're walking by, and you notice over in that corner table, there's a guy, and he's crying. What's your first reaction? Get away. Wimp. What else? Drunk. Exactly. This is what I hear over and over again. People immediately come up with that. I came up with that, and I was working with them. This is not something that is just a couple of people. This is almost all of us have this bias that's built in that says, man's pain, get away. There's something wrong with that guy. He's probably drunk, So we're all built to not want to get close to men's pain. Men know this. They know it. They know no one wants to hear this crap. In fact, the guys that sit with, they look at me and they say, do you really want to hear this? They couldn't believe that someone would want to listen to their pain. It's sad. So the first thing that tipped me off was that men's pain is invisible because a man's pain is taboo. Now there's another one. The provide and protect rule. Oh boy. So you provide and protect people. Well, guess what? Who's providing and protecting for you? Nobody. Nobody's providing and protecting. Think about, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you and your wife wake up, there's a big noise down in the basement. Boom, something goes. Who's going down to check it out?
Not me.
That's a woman said that. Who's going down to check it out? Guess what? In today's world, women may very well say, I'll go down and check that out. And if she did that, she'd be a hero, right? But women's roles are very flexible these days. She'd not only be a hero, but if she said, honey, I really don't want to do that. Can you go? It'd be fine. Nobody get upset, right? There's no problem. Now, how about the guy? If he goes down and checks it out, he's doing his job. Right? That's what he's supposed to do. He is the guy. But if he says, no, honey, I don't want to go, he's a jackass. Can you see the double standard that's going on? Men are expected to never be dependent. Never be dependent. And guess what? You can't emote and be not be dependent. The two are linked. They're linked up. So men strive to not be dependent for good reasons, because the culture whips them into that. There's a guy named Peter Marin. He wrote this beautiful piece on homelessness and men. But one of the things in the piece stuck with me. And he talked about men and dependency. Listen to what he says. To put it simply, men are neither supposed nor allowed to be dependent. Men are not supposed to be or allowed to be dependent. They're expected to take care of others and themselves. And when they cannot or will not do it, then the assumption at the heart of the culture is that they are somehow less than men and therefore unworthy of help. Get it? An irony asserts itself. By being in need of help, men forfeit the right to it. Does that make sense? A guy comes out and he says, I don't need that help. I'm fine. I'm a man, right? Hey, no problem. He doesn't get the help. But if a guy comes out and he says, you know, I really need some help today, people automatically have a view of him. There's something wrong with that guy, right? He doesn't deserve this help. It's a very powerful double standard that goes on for men that keeps them, again, from wanting to emote in public, wanting to bring it out so people can see it. Very different. Now, the third reason is the dominance hierarchy. You guys know about the bighorn sheep, right? Bighorn sheep, the males once a year get together and they get 20 yards apart and then boogity, 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 boom, boogity, 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 boom, right? Have you seen that? You know, the YouTubes of that. What are they doing? What are they doing? They're setting up the hierarchy. They're setting it up so who's first, second, third, fourth, and they're going to be that dominant male at the top. And the dominant male at the top is what? He gets the best reproductive success, right? This is what men strive for. And now we know, or we're thinking we know, that there is in fact a dominance hierarchy in human males. There's a dominance hierarchy in human males where we strive for status. Men strive for status. This is a little bit tricky because it's not like, it's not simple. Because if there's men who are peace lovers, they may strive to be the best peace lover. A guy on the football field, he's going to strive to make the NFL. Academe is going to strive for having as many journal articles in prestigious journals as he can. There's this striving that's inherent in men that we do in order to create status and therefore increase our reproductive success. Does that make sense? What happens if someone is striving for status and they emote in public? Your status drops like a rock. So you sure as heck do not want to go out in public and emote because that ruins all the status you've been working to build up. Now, they're also thinking that women do not have the same kind of hierarchical requirements that men have, but they do have one hierarchy where they live. Do you know what it is? How do women compete with each other? There's one issue: attractiveness. Attractiveness. Look at the cosmetics industry, the billions of dollars that goes into that. Women will compete with each other based on who is more attractive than whom, and they strive to go to the top, right? Have you ever seen a woman say, I'm not leaving home right now because I don't have my makeup on, right? Have you seen that? What's she doing? She is saying, in my hierarchy, I'm not going to look lower until I can prop myself up and look better. She's doing the same thing that the men get crap for. You know, the men get crap for this not emoting so much. But they're just doing the same thing. They're trying to not let themselves be exposed in public in the very same way that the woman is trying to look as good as she can. So we need to love them both. Love men and women.
all meine Zeit. Der Fluch der Ewigkeit lastet auf meinem Haupt. Es gibt ein Wort und ein Gefühl für alles, doch hierfür nicht. Es gibt ein Wort und ein Gefühl für alles, doch hierfür nicht. Langsam lösen sich die Meme aus meinem Geist.